This is really a short general overview about neurofeedback, its benefits, how it works, and of course, to give you some opportunity to ask some questions if you have so at the end. So just to tell you a little bit about my story, I'm trained as a psychotherapist. I've been in private practice for over, almost 25 years. And about 12 years ago, I was introduced to neurofeedback by a client of mine at a meditation retreat. And I was very curious about it because, in the field of mental health, we're dealing with both the brain and the mind and our behaviors. And one of the things we're always trying to explore is how to get that automatic functioning brain to stop doing those maladaptive patterns that it does on autopilot. And so when I found out that there was this new technology that used the feedback of how the brain communicates electrically to let that automatic functioning brain know that it's doing a maladaptive pattern, or in other words, the wrong thing in the present moment, I was very intrigued. So I researched a whole bunch of systems, talked to psychotherapists in particular who were doing neurofeedback, and found a system that really I thought was the best out there. And so let me just take a few minutes to talk about what neurofeedback is. So I alluded to a minute ago that neurofeedback is a way that we can give that automatic functioning brain information that it needs to optimize its performance. And we do that through tracking the electrical communication of the brain. So the brain communicates through chemicals, neurotransmitters, and we've all heard about dopamine, and then also electrically. And so neurofeedback specifically is monitoring and assessing the electrical communication of the brain. And it does that through EEG sensors that attaches to the head. You'll see some systems have caps. The system I use has two attached to the sides of the head and clipped to the ears. But basically, what the neurofeedback technology is doing is it's using that electrical information to gather data to assess when the brain is going into maladaptive patterns, and then it gives feedback to that automatic functioning brain, either through auditory or visual feedback. And something to know about neurofeedback, just to back up a little bit, is that the term neurofeedback is a term that describes a process, and it's not very specific. And so when you're researching neurofeedback systems, one of the things you're going to discover is that there are lots of technology that call themselves neurofeedback, but they can function very differently. And that the range, especially in the last few years, has increased to include things like, simple headband devices that use dry sensors, and the technology of a smartphone to give neurofeedback, all the way up to using MRI machines. And moment-to-moment data you get from an MRI machine to give feedback. So it's a huge range of technologies that call themselves neurofeedback. So it's really important to know what your needs are, and then really to look at what's the actual technology. But in its development over the decades, neurofeedback has really been dependent upon the speed of computer technology and the cost of that technology. So when neurofeedback systems were first developed, that is called protocol neurofeedback or linear neurofeedback, you had to take out a lot of the functioning because computers and home computers weren't at the speed of the human brain. And so that's why you have some systems that require a brain map. because that at the time when those systems were developed, the technology couldn't give feedback at the speed at which the brain processes information. So you had to outsource the assessment piece. So what is the brain doing that's maladaptive? And those are called brain maps or QEEGs. A lot of systems still use those. Brain maps are good for about 3 months, and then you have to take another mapping in order to see what's changed. And with protocol systems, they're also different in that there's an expert trainer who uses that data to set protocols to nudge or entrain and migrate the brain out of those maladaptive patterns and into adaptive ones. And they have to work in a linear fashion. And that's the other thing about the earlier systems, is that even though the brain is a nonlinear dynamical system, so that means it works in ways that are variable and addressing all sorts of things simultaneously. With the earlier neurofeedback systems, you had to train one cluster of symptoms at a time. So whether that's anxiety or ADHD, depression, and then you work on one, and then you tweak it, and then you work on the next set of protocols. So when I was looking at systems, there are the protocol systems, and then there was this other new system that was based on a different philosophy of how you could work, and that you could actually work dynamically with the brain as it organically and naturally changes itself. But the key to this technology was that computers had to get to the speed of the human brain in order to offer real-time dynamical feedback to the individual brain so it can change itself. So this system, there's one on the market, it's called NeurOptimal. It's the system I use. I chose it because of a number of factors. One is that it's dynamical. So that means it's looking at everything simultaneously in real time. The brain mapping is integrated into the technology. So it's always real-time feedback, and it's always about everything that's maladaptive. And we know in ourselves, and if it's for our children, there's multiple issues going on, right? If we have stress issues, right, there's sleep, maybe we're irritable, maybe we're having a hard time focusing. If it's our child with ADHD, they're having issues with impulsivity, as well as focus, possibly sleep, possibly anxiety. And so, the cluster of our symptoms as humans is often diverse. So I was very interested in a system that could address everything simultaneously. And the other big positive feature about the system, and why I chose it, is that it's fully automated. And so whether someone comes into my office, or they rent a system, or they purchase a system, they're getting the exact same technology. And now we have this opportunity for different environments to train. Training children at home is so much easier than bringing them into an office. And also, if you're going to train multiple family members, much easier to do it at home. And also, the price points vary so that it makes it more affordable for families. So for all those reasons, I chose the NeurOptimal system. A couple of points on this slide just to point out is that if you're interested in understanding the history of neurofeedback, I recommend this book, A Symphony in the Brain. It's written by a New York Times science writer. And then if your area of interest is in trauma and healing trauma, whether it's big T traumas or developmental traumas, The Body Keep the Score by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk is a terrific book. It's a little bit dated. It doesn't actually include NeurOptimal in the neurofeedback section, nor does Symphony in the Brain. But they're really great for understanding, how neurofeedback works, and also, how we need to address the brain and brain functioning and brain training as part of working with trauma. So as I mentioned, neurofeedback is really about assessing brainwave function. And this is just a simple graph to just show you that there are different brainwave clusters that are associated with different kinds of functioning in the brain. And so when we want to have different activities, those brain waves should match that activity. So delta should be high when it's time to go to sleep, as example. Here's an example of a protocol system where it's mostly visual feedback, and there's the CAP. This is the system I use, the NeurOptimal system. It's a much simpler setup. There's 2 clipped to the ears and attached to the head. Nothing comes back through those wires. It's just taking feedback to the computer system that you see in this picture. It does, I think it's like 150,000 mathematical calculations on the data moment by moment. So it's a very sophisticated technology. It's on a dedicated computer. So just to kind of go back a little bit and talk a little more about how neurofeedback works and why it's important, is because, you know, we understand that the body needs exercise, right? We all get it, that in order for the heart to perform at its best, we need to get exercise. And then, of course, we know that there are certain foods that are good for a healthy heart. We have all sorts of exercise that's good. And we have to also understand the brain is also an organ. It's an organ that's intimate with our cognitive functioning and our emotional well-being, as well as memory and all sorts of things. And so one of the things we want to do is that we want to know that when we're working on taking care of the brain and brain function, we want to be able to identify and address it from multiple angles. So psychopharmaceuticals for mental health symptoms is one way. Exercise and taking care of the body is another way. We want to just really make it so that we can address all symptoms from a holistic point of view. And so when it comes to brain functioning, why we get symptoms is because the brain gets habituated. And so we understand that the brain tries to optimize itself with using its energy efficiently and also being effective. And when we get symptoms, it's because the brain doesn't register and recognize that it's performing functions that it thinks are addressing the problem, but really it's just a misperception of what the current problem is. And I'm going to use the stress response as an example to just demonstrate to you why brain training is so important. Just to talk a little bit about how the brain gets habituated, how neurofeedback helps the brain function better. And I'm going to use the example of the stress response, but we could also be talking about a head injury. We could be talking about ADHD. But this is the most fundamental system that gets habituated, and we all experience this even when we take good care of ourselves, because it's just a limitation of how our brain is designed at this point, which is this limbic brain, which is our survival brain. It doesn't take orders from the prefrontal cortex because it's all about survival. And so what happens is that there are events, and this is also what happens in trauma. So we can talk about big traumas and little traumas, but what happens is that there is an event that happens in our lives that our brain perceives as a significant life-threatening event. And that means danger is something that's going to harm us in less than a minute. So that limbic brain takes over and it goes, I'm going to punch it, I'm going to run from it, or I'm going to play dead as my survival strategy. So you see that as item number 1. So my fancy graph, right? So this is a brain that's regulated. It's perceiving the environment as safe. So it's open. That's when we can connect easily with others. We're not as speedy. We can be responsive rather than reactive. We can focus when we need to. We can fall asleep at night. We can stay asleep. That's what the regulated brain, when the limbic brain is perceiving safety, this is where it lives. It lives in zone number 2. So when we have events that the brain registers as about to cause bodily harm, it automatically decides I'm either going to go into hyperarousal and use my fight flight, or I'm going to go into hypoarousal, the bottom here, and I'm going to play dead. And then ideally what the brain is supposed to do is when that event ends, right? So the bear that's coming towards us turns and goes the other way, right? We clamber down from the tree, right? We fled to the tree, we clamber down, and then we come back to perceiving a safe environment. So what happens, unfortunately, is that the brain, in trying to be efficient, will just use simple cues to decide what's happening in the present moment. And what it will do is it'll take a cue that's similar from that genuinely threatening situation and go, oh, now's like that. So I'm going to go up into my hyperarousal again. And I'm going to be, I'm going to speed up. I'm going to start breathing from the top of my chest. I'm going to have speedy thoughts. I'm going to have, and that's what happens when the brain gets habituated. That limbic brain takes simple cues from the environment and goes, I know what this is. And it repeats a stress response, even though your environment is safe. So here comes the neurofeedback piece. The neurofeedback piece is to show that brain that it's misperceiving the here and now, that it's doing the wrong thing in the present moment. So the system that I use, the NeurOptimal system, how it operates is it's taking that EEG data, it's taking it to the computer, the software analyzes it, and it's looking for something that's like the precursor of state change. And in the millisecond that precursor of state change is identified, through auditory feedback, music is interrupted, and that cues the brain, pay attention. And the brain is designed to pay attention to everything simultaneously, the external environment and our internal environment. And when it sees a misalignment, that brain is designed to realign, right? So if we're in a stress reaction, and the brain sees, I'm sitting quietly in a room, there's music playing, I'm doing neurofeedback, why am I going into a stress response? So it's going to realign. But the most significant piece, and why we call it brain training, is that over the series of sessions, the brain is learning something valuable. It's learning that all the good data for making efficient and effective decisions is in the here and now. So what that brain will start to do is, regardless of what the maladaptive patterns are, again, if it's ADHD in a child, if it's recovering from a stroke, if it is stress and irritability, anxiety, that brain is going to see what is maladaptive, because it's now going to practice coming into the present moment, gathering data before making a decision. So that means over time, that brain is going to be more and more aligned with the here and now, which means it's going to calm down and cheer up and live in that regulated zone. And so what we experience when we do the training is that we're better able to focus. We're less impulsive, right? Our communication with others isn't reactive so much as it is the ability to pause and respond, right? In terms of brain functioning, the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of our brain, which is our willful selves, it's our planner, it's the ability to pause and think things through. This part of the brain is more online. The limbic brain is less active. because that brain is now seeing, no, I actually live in safety. Okay, I can calm down. I don't have to be in charge as much. The thing that happens for brain injury recovery is the same process, which is that when there's an initial injury, that brain registers that there's damage and it goes into triage, but then pretty soon that habituation takes over and it doesn't reassess continuously. So for anybody who's had head injuries, now that brain is registering and paying attention to what is going on in the present moment. So this is a slide that explains in more detail how this system works. There is an amplifier which turns the voltage into numbers, which then gets fed into the software of the system. It analyzes based on chaos theory mathematics, that data, looking 265 times per second for state change in order to give feedback. And the sessions themselves last 33 minutes. The primary feedback is auditory. You don't have to be focused on a screen. There is a screen if you want to play a movie for a child or just watch the pixelation. There is secondary feedback visually, but it's not primary, which is really great if you're dealing with kids who don't focus easily, children who are on the autism spectrum. I have parents who train them at night when they're sleeping, especially if they have sensory issues. So it's a very kind of user-friendly system. And then in terms of how often people should train, you know, we're teaching the brain a new way to function. So when we train more quickly, more often, we learn faster. So it's very safe to use. It's registered with the FDA as a general wellness device, not a medical device. So the FDA registers it and recognizes it as safe to use by anybody. You don't need to have medical oversight. So you can use this for children at any age. You can train daily. You can train every other day. You can train 3 times a week. The most important thing is consistency. Another really important thing is that we have self-assessment checklists as a way to track progress, as well as just your own, you know, awareness of change. But the thing about this that's really important to understand is we're training that limbic brain that functions automatically. So a lot of the changes are going to just happen seamlessly. And some of the changes are not in kind of your window of what you're focused on. They're kind of outside. And using the tracking tools are a great way to capture all of the changes. So I'm working with a woman who is in her early 50s. She has ADHD. She had some, you know, developmental trauma. And when we had our check-in after her 2nd month, and she was like, yeah, Natalie, I think I'm calmer. My mom says I'm more cheerful on the phone. I think I'm better able to focus. And then when I looked at her first checklist and her second one on factors like impulsivity and focus, she was down 50%. And so that kind of data is very helpful for people. I have someone here who just chimed in that the tracking tools are crucial. So that's one thing that takes a little bit of effort, but it so pays off in order to really get the confidence that this is happening. And so here is a teenager doing NeurOptimal. You'll see that they have the music playing, but they're actually have a video game that they're playing on mute as a way to do the sessions. So one of the things when you're training kids and teenagers is you want to get creative to get them to do it. Some kids, you know, are very happy to do what their parents say, and other kids need some convincing. So, you know, it's a great thing that it's just auditory because they can do something else visually. So if it's a reward to play a video game or do something else, you know, please engage them in dialogue to get the sessions done. So I'm going to pause here because I've been talking for 25 minutes and I really want to give you the opportunity to ask me any questions. And let's see, I think other details like this you can, you know, find on my website, and certainly you can reach out to us. And so, all right, here's a question. My son is hyperactive. He can't stay still for more than 2 minutes. How should this work? He has autism and is 6 years old. This is a great question. And so this is about trial and error. You know, the number one reason people don't see results is because they don't get the sessions in. So I always work very closely with people to help them strategize to get the sessions in. And every kid is different, and you know your kid, and so it's really a back and forth. So if you have a hyperactive child, the first question, is there anything that will get that child to sit still for 10 minutes? Or can you do an activity with them during the session and just keep pressing down those sensors as they wiggle around? Because there's no downside to the sensor coming off. It just means they're not getting feedback during that moment, and then you can reapply them. So that's one thing, is just, is there anything that they will do for 10 minutes? Because you can set the sessions for shorter periods of time. And what I've seen some parents do is that they start with 10, then they move to 15, and as the nervous system is re-regulating, they can tolerate longer periods of time. Another thing I think I mentioned was training a child when they're sleeping. So when they go into kind of their deep sleep, about 30 minutes into sleeping, I have parents who hook their kids up and they do the session, have it on quiet while the child is sleeping. And they do that for the first period of time, again, knowing that the brain is going to re-regulate, they're going to calm down. They're not going to be hyperactive forever. So it's really just the first chunk of training, first couple of weeks, that you have to be persistent and be creative about getting those sessions in. And so there's another question about where is your office and why is this normally so pricey? And are there side effects, which is another really important thing I failed to mention. And so one of the things to understand is that this is safe. This is not a system that you are forcing state change in the brain at all. And so really to be confident that you can train children daily. All you're doing is giving interruptions in the music. That's the only intervention that's happening. But the point is, it's cueing the brain in the millisecond that it needs to see itself. And so it's safe to use at any age. It's safe to use daily. In terms of the cost of the system, so neurofeedback devices in general are very expensive. There's a lot of research and development that goes into them, particularly the more advanced, sophisticated ones. And so in the case of neurofeedback, you really get what you pay for. And so if you're buying like a headband device that's like $300, you're getting a system that's basically just kind of forcing state change in the present. So it'll force like focusing for a moment, but as soon as you take that device off, it stops giving that feedback. So the price is really about the sophistication of the technology. Certainly NeurOptimal is the least expensive at this level of sophistication because you can train at home. And also if you think about, you know, if you're going to train your child over a period of time, the longer you have your system, the least expensive it is. The whole family can train. And so, you know, you're looking at $20 a session. for an intervention that for some kids is the difference between, you know, really doing well at school and having good self-esteem, and really thriving versus struggling through their academic career and their sense of self, and also just the whole family system. So part of it, even though, yes, this absolutely is an investment for sure, the payoff for the investment, in my observation, is really worth it. And in terms of side effects with different neurofeedback systems, I should say something about that, which is that the protocol systems, because the trainer is setting protocols to entrain and migrate different brainwave frequencies, you can get slightly over and under training. So people can feel lethargic, or they can feel kind of speedy, and then they give feedback and the trainer resets. But those kind of side effects are temporary. And if you have an expert trainer, they should be able to alter the training to adjust it. I do want to talk also about a side effect quality that isn't what we really call side effects, which, you know, if you take a medication, right, and a side effect is it gives you, you know, heart palpitations, and that is due to the chemicals in the medication. That's sort of how we traditionally think about side effects. How I think about some of the side effects for people is a little differently, which is that when you're doing neurofeedback, what happens is greater awareness arises. And that's part of the brain optimizing and improving its functioning. Because if we're aware, then we can do something about it, whatever it is. But if we're not aware, if we're dissociated, or if we're sleep deprived, we can't be aware. And so one of the side effects of greater awareness is that people feel their symptoms more acutely. And so some people don't like that, right? Especially if the experience is emotional pain or the exhaustion of sleep deprivation. And they'll say, Natalie, I'm doing the neurofeedback and I'm starting to feel more anxious, or I'm starting to feel kind of more like sadness, or I'm exhausted. That is not a side effect in the sense that the neurofeedback is doing that to your brain. That's a side effect in that your brain is now improving its functioning, which means you have greater awareness of what's in your body as your felt experience. And then you now can do something, right? So if the brain is showing you exhaustion and you're sleeping 5 hours a night, it's trying to say, hey, please put me to bed earlier. I need more sleep. Or if you're experiencing sadness, right? A defense we all have is numbness, dissociation. We don't want to feel our pain, right? But when we do that, we're actually covering and pushing something down. It takes energy to do that. A healthy system doesn't want to do this anymore. It wants to release. It wants trauma and pain to be seen, acknowledged, resolved, so we can then move on. So one of the things I've seen with people is that they actually process their trauma, which part of it is grieving. And if we can't go through the process of healing without feeling our feelings, which will resolve themselves. And so that's just a category of side effect that I really wanted to say something about. So thank you for prompting me with your question, because it's very important. We have to be mindful of what our judgments are, right? What we like and what we don't like, and how that can be different from what the brain is going to do in order to optimize and improve its functioning. And so what's the difference between neurofeedback and the magnetic resonance therapy? Yeah, they are approved neurofeedback devices. Yeah, so that is more of the protocol-based system. So a lot of the protocol-based systems, they've gone to the FDA to be approved as medical devices. You can only use them in a medical facility with a trained, licensed healthcare provider, because again, they have to analyze the data of what's maladaptive as shown through whatever means they use to brain imaging, QEEG data, and then they have to set protocols to nudge the brain. And so absolutely those systems work. They need to be done under, like, someone who's been doing it. I always recommend like 10 to 15 years is what you want in your provider. And just to know that they have to work linearly. So they have to work on one thing at a time in order to, achieve the goals because of the way those systems are designed. I've gone about 8 minutes over here, so I want to just take a minute to see if anybody has any last questions. Happy to answer them. Also, you can always email me, Natalie at Neurofeedback Training. I'll put that in the chat here. If you have any follow-up questions, more than happy to connect with you. So I'll just wait a minute to see if there's anything else that would be helpful for you all to hear at this time. Maybe I'll just say one thing as we're waiting, which is that, one of the beautiful things for me about bringing neurofeedback into my psychotherapy practice is that it really reinforced for me that we really have to think about ourselves as a whole system. And so when you think about what you're going to do as an intervention or as interventions to address specific symptoms or conditions, or for peak mental performance, that you really try to think holistically. And the most important factors are things like exercise, sleep, regulating your sleep, 7 to 8 hours. If you have dysregulated sleep, please give yourself 3 months on good sleep hygiene and possibly neurofeedback to re-regulate your sleep. Sleep is so important. We discovered in the last 10 years that there's a very subtle lymphatic system in the brain, and that brain flushes metabolic waste, toxins from the brain when we sleep. So basically, we flush toxins when we sleep. It's so important for brain health. So we've got exercise, we've got sleep, we have diet. A big understanding that's happening in mental health and physical health in general is inflammation, and how inflammation creates disease, and how eating a low inflammatory diet can prevent disease and optimize brain performance. So really encourage you to look at what a low inflammatory food diet is. A Mediterranean diet is one of them. Whole foods, less sugar. If you have a kid with ADHD, try to minimize processed foods. They're often sensitive to dyes and things like that. And really also look at lifestyle. Who are you hanging out with? Do you hang out with loving people? Are you involved in activities, that are meaningful to you? Do you have a meaningful connection with your community? Really think about your health as a holistic system, and one that a lot of them do not require a lot of money. And so if neurofeedback is out of your price point, look at other things like diet and exercise. Like, those are two huge things that if we can get kids getting exercise off their devices a little more, we see that the gray matter of the brain shrinks when we use our devices too much. So really unhealthy. So detox the devices, diet and exercise in kids. Those 3 things are wonderful for optimizing brain performance in children. So I haven't seen any new questions, so I'm just going to say thank you. Paul, yes, I will send out the slides in the follow-up email. Again, my apologies that you couldn't see them. And, reach out with any questions. I'm here for you, and I'm really excited that you're considering neurofeedback. It truly is a transformative brain training if you have the time and the resources to engage. So I hope you all have a good Friday and a good weekend. And thank you for showing up. Take care.